She had been sleeping longer than anyone could remember. The hospital rooms smelled of antiseptic and lilies, of time thickened into routine. Machines hummed in steady rhythms like distant waves. Nurses passed through in careful choreography. Outside, the city built new towers and tore down the old. Inside, she remained as she had been when the world stopped around her. The wealthy wife of a billionaire, pulled from life 20 years earlier and placed gently on the edge of forever. For 2 decades he had kept vigil. The billionaire came and went, a man of carved decisions, of private jets and guarded smiles. He moved through the world with the same quiet fury he brought to the hospital room each evening, fingers pressed to the hand that did not squeeze back. Wealth bought specialists and consultations, experimental treatments flown in from distant clinics, machines wrapped in patents and promises. Progress fed on hope but returned only whispers. Then she passed from 90 to 80, from 80 to 70, and the people who had loved her grew fewer. Staff changed, doctors retired. The nurses who once called her by name were now stories told in the break room. The mansion where her presence once filled halls felt colder, its portraits like pages in a book with one page missing. The household had shrunk into efficiency. A manager who handled logistics, a small medical team that rotated in and out, and a new line of young staff who learned how to move around the sleeping woman without tripping on the ghosts. It was into this quiet routine that the new maid arrived, a woman with tired hands and an honest laugh. She brought with her a small son, a boy with sneakers that had seen better days and eyes too bright for the kitchen. The billionaire watched the pair with the cautious curiosity he reserved for all new variables. Not everything could be measured, but he measured enough to know that she came from a part of the city where the lights were different. She spoke plainly, and the boy spoke with the sort of respect that felt earned. They were hired because the estate needed hands and the manager liked the way the woman cleaned the pantry without fuss. The boy learned the house like a map drawn by footsteps. He found shortcuts through the gardens, discovered a locked conservatory filled with glass sculptures, and learned to avoid the library after dark. Most importantly, he learned where the woman in the bed was. He watched the guests and the staff with an attention that made them uneasy, like a small ship watching a larger one and not blinking. The first time the boy stood at the foot of the bed, he did not ask why she did not wake. He did not offer platitudes. He only observed, and what he observed became stitches in something that had been unraveling. He noticed the way the sunlight angled through the blinds at noon and how the woman's hair, though thin, still caught the light like a promise. He noticed the ring on her finger and the photographs on the table, faces he did not know but felt were important. At night he would sit quietly and tell her the stories he had learned from his mother. Tales of neighborhood cats who ruled subway tunnels, of a lemonade stand that turned into a friendship, of a barber who sang before he cut. He spoke softly enough that only the machines and the moon could hear. The nurses found it odd at first, but they warmed to the boy's devotion. There was something tender about the ordinary things he said, as if he believed the world could be coaxed awake by memory. The billionaire believed in things that were documented, measured, and proven. He did not believe in lullabies. He hired neurologists who spoke of synapses and metabolic slowdowns, of scar tissue and patterns of brain activity that had long since rerouted. Their reports were thick, their words careful. The family read them like verdicts. Hope, carefully managed, was a different sort of wealth. But the boy kept coming. He played piano in the foyer before breakfast, his fingers finding melodies by ear. He read comic books beside the conservatory fountain. He insisted on doing small chores in the room where the woman slept, arranging fresh towels, fluffing a pillow a certain way. The staff began to anticipate his presence. On a damp autumn morning, a young therapist arrived with a plan curated from the latest research. She introduced a program that combined sensory stimulation with personalized cues designed to reconnect long unactivated neural pathways. The billionaire listened politely and approved the list of exercises. They would try music, textured fabrics, smells tied to memory. They would role-play, they would expose, they would test. The therapist asked for items that might hold meaning. Photographs were gathered and labeled. A small box of trinkets came from a niece who had flown in from Minnesota. No one thought to ask the maid and her son for contributions. They assumed comfortable things and family heirlooms were not present in the small apartment the woman left. The maid slipped in an old scarf the boy had been clutching. It smelled faintly of the laundromat and lemon soap and the boy's mother. It was not a silk scarf or one with embroidered initials. It was simple, worn soft in a way that made it comfortable to hold. The therapist hesitated but then placed the scarf near the woman's face during a session. Everyone watched the monitors. For the first week there were small upticks in brain activity, the kind that made the charts twitch and specialists say careful words like promising. The billionaire allowed himself private moments of optimism, though he still dressed in skepticism. The boy kept telling stories and the maid kept arranging her small rituals. The mansion's rhythm altered imperceptibly, a chair with a child's scuffed sole left in the hall, a bowl with a single orange on the kitchen table, a laugh slipping through the staff rooms at odd hours. Then came the night of the thunderstorm. Lightning stitched the sky and the power faltered. Emergency protocols engaged, generators hummed and lights steadied. The machines continued their steady chorus. The boy, who had been sent to bed by his mother, slipped out and carried a flashlight to the hospital suite. He stood at the foot of the bed and shone the soft beam across the woman's face. He did not speak at first. He simply sat on a chair and opened a small dog-eared book of poems his father had given him once. It was full of narrow handwriting and coffee stains. The boy read aloud because that was what boys did when they were brave and alone. They made their own courage into a voice. As he read, the lines were ordinary and raw. The room smelled of rain and old paper. At the passage about a lighthouse, the woman's fingers twitched. A nurse glanced at the monitor, then at the boy, then back again. The billionaire, who had come to check on the medical team during the storm, arrived at the door and froze. One movement became two. The woman's eyelids fluttered like a curtain. Her lips formed the shadow of a word. The room held its breath. She exhaled. It was not cinematic. There were no triumphant fanfares. She breathed, steady and human, as if rediscovering how to be small in a world that had been made enormous without her. She blinked, slowly, with the caution of someone stepping into daylight after a long, careful journey. The monitor's blips altered their cadence and the nurses flooded the room. Words spilled in a rush, urgent medical language, excited relief, controlled tears. The billionaire stood back, palms pressed together as if holding himself from breaking. The boy kept reading because reading is a ritual and because some things are held together by constancy. The maid stood frozen with her hand over her heart. The staff who had swapped stories about the sleeping woman for 20 years were suddenly scrambling to collect the pieces of a life that had started again. In the days that followed, the world outside took notice. Reporters arrived like migrating birds, their microphones held like curious beaks. The billionaire's face was photographed from angles that made him look both monstrous and small. There were theories that the boy had unlocked some secret, that the scarf held an essence like a spell, that the thunderstorm had jolted some ancient circuit. The hospital released a statement about cautious progress and careful monitoring. But inside, away from cameras and headlines, the recovery was a private conversation. The woman could not speak more than a string of words at first. Her name came back like a pebble tossed into a pond, each syllable making the surface ripple. She could not stand for long and her muscles needed coaxing. She mistook a photograph for someone she once knew and then corrected herself with a laugh that sounded like rediscovery. The billionaire moved differently now. He sat cross-legged with the impatience of a man learning to listen. He brought no suits to the hospital at first, only a sweater that smelled faintly of cedar and paper. He apologized for things he had not known he had done. Sometimes he mentioned the woman as if she might still be a stranger, and then corrected himself with a story about the dinner they had on a winter yacht in 2004. He learned to say I was wrong and then meant it. The maid and her son became fixtures of the slow mornings and long evenings. The boy would read newspapers aloud, translating the headlines into comic strips and marvels for the woman. He would hum songs he had invented, and she would smile like a person remembering the taste of an old candy. She clung to the smallness of things, a hand that fit over hers, the warmth of soup, the cadence of a neighbor's cough in the distance. As her memories returned, they were not a tidy archive. They arrived like postcards with torn edges, flashes of laughter at a party, a smell of jasmine, a child's bright shoes. She remembered a child whose face she could not place and a conversation that had led to a man making a decision that weighed on them both. Fragments of anger surfaced, then softened into explanations. He listened to it all. He learned the contours of regret in a way the market never taught him. Money had paid for sleep, but it had not bought the small gestures that stitch people back together. An embroidered handkerchief handed at the right moment, a joke told badly but with love, a promise to be there. Then, as she grew stronger, the woman asked for the boy by name. She asked her to be brought the scarf that smelled of lemon soap. She reached for it and pressed it to her face, and the room found a new kind of quiet, the kind that belongs to people who have seen each other through storms and are now learning to speak in the language of return. The billionaire, who had once hidden his grief in appointments and ledgers, did something awkward and profound. He sat with the maid and her son in a small, sunlit room away from the cameras and said thank you. He tried to find words that could balance debt and gratitude and failed. Instead, he offered them security, a place to live, support for school, a hand that had once only counted gold reaching for something warmer. They refused at first because kindness often requires time to be trusted. The maid understood poverty's protocols. Offers like that could feel like chains. But the woman, now finding her voice with a clarity born from having been silent, asked them to accept. She told the maid a memory that explained everything. A winter night when she had been alone and terrified, a waitress who had brought hot soup and a song, a small act that had made a difference she had never stopped looking for. The maid, who had never expected to meet the woman she had once helped from across a crowded room, felt a slow relief spread through her chest. In quiet moments she asked about the boy's life. She learned how he loved to draw comic book heroes with uneven capes, how he had fixed a neighbor's fence for a bag of potatoes, how he worried about his mother getting sick. She laughed when he told her he once tried to make coffee and nearly flooded the kitchen. They shared stories in the garden where moths settled like confetti on fallen petals. Recovery never followed the neat arcs of movies. There were days of anger when fragments of memory wounded more than healed, days when her body refused to obey. There were legal meetings and medical consultations and articles published about the miracle that required a patient reading of clinical notes. There were people who wanted to claim credit, and there were opportunists who wanted to sell the scarf to the highest bidder. The billionaire shut down those conversations with a firmness that came from having learned there are some things beyond commerce. Over time, the woman reclaimed parts of her life. A favorite armchair in the study, the ritual of tending to a small potted plant, the way she liked her tea with a slice of lemon. She insisted the boy keep his sneakers and his comic books, and in a small ceremony she tied a ribbon in his hair like a knight being knighted. The house felt fuller. The portraits looked less like memorials and more like snapshots. The change in the billionaire was not magical. He still made difficult choices. But now he made them with a steadier hand and a listening heart. He began to fund programs for children in neighborhoods like the one the maid had come from. He listened when the woman suggested measures that would help others, and he found that giving back felt less like an expense and more like a return to an account he had once ignored. One afternoon, 2 years after she had opened her eyes, the woman walked, slowly with a walker and with the boy's hand in hers, from the hospital room to a small sunroom in the mansion. The staff lined the hallway like a current of applause. The billionaire walked behind them, his shoulders relaxed in a way that made him look younger. She paused in the doorway, looked at the boy and said simply, "Thank you." There were no cameras in that room. No pundit declared who deserved credit. The story unraveled into small truths: a child's constancy, a mother's courage, a man's capacity to change. People told versions that fit their narratives, but the actual miracle was quieter. It was the accumulation of ordinary acts stacked until they reached a threshold. A scarf, a poem, a flashlight, a nurse's steady hands, a billionaire learning to say "I'm sorry." Years later, when headlines had long moved on, the woman would sit by the window and watch the rain. She would hold the scarf in her lap and trace its faded lines with the tenderness of someone who had been given back a life. The boy grew into a young man who designed toys and built mechanisms that made life a little easier for others. The maid opened a small cafe near the laundromat. The billionaire, who still kept a ledger, now wrote entries about people rather than profits. Some people call it a miracle. Others call it chance. The family called it a second beginning. And when the boy visited, he would still sit at the foot of the bed and read aloud from a book full of coffee stains. The woman would close her eyes and listen, because she had learned that the world, for all its grandness, could be reassembled in the tender currency of stories, and the steady beat of small, consistent care was enough still.